With Augustus on the run, Charles turned to the beleaguered fortress town of Narva in present-day Estonia. R. Nisbet Bain says, quote, "The town of Narva is situated on a narrow neck of land, round which the Narova River makes a wide bend." Peter had recently concluded his Azov campaign, freeing him up to declare war on Sweden in late August. He was at the head of a massive army of over 40,000 Russians, who had laid waste to the countryside and were besieging the fortress at present. Things were desperate for the Swedes inside Narva, so Charles endeavored to liberate the garrison. He marched his men over terrible roads in barren country, with winter nipping at the heels of the Swedes. The confidence Charles's soldiers and officers had in him momentarily wavered in the face of these miserable conditions. Even his stalwart supporters began to see the folly in attacking a force which was 3 times as large as the army of Sweden. John Reinskjold, one of Sweden's best generals, said, quote, "If the king succeeds, there never was anyone who had to triumph over such obstacles," unquote. On November 17th, a small detachment of Swedes, headed by Charles, came into contact with 5,000 Russians defending the Pyhäjoki Pass. They rapidly withdrew in the face of the blue-clad Swedish warriors. Tsar Peter had instructed the Russian commander to do as much, but Swedish propaganda turned this retreat into a major battle and rout of Russian forces. This emboldened and heartened the army as they pushed into the outskirts of the besieged city of Narva. On the Russian side, Peter believed that any fight would occur after the Swedish had rested, built a fortified camp, and gathered supplies. This was usually how field battles were conducted. Very rarely were generals impetuous enough to strike boldly into the unknown, but Charles was prepared to do just that. Peter, meanwhile, left his army under the command of a French general who was absolutely hated by the men under his command. The Russian army was a miscellaneous grouping of peasant conscripts who were hemmed in by their own fortifications. In a style similar to the Roman siege of the Gallic city of Alesia, they had built double walls around the city to besiege it and around their army to protect themselves. R. Nisbet Bain says these fortifications were, quote, "defended by 140 cannons." However, the Karelians were not the Gallic hordes of yesteryear, and the Russians were not Roman legionaries. Charles recognized that these fortifications hindered Russian movement, so he decided to attack their position immediately with his exhausted army of barely 15,000. He lined up his infantry into 2 distinct columns. Both were designed to crash into and devastate the Russian center at different ends, and then rapidly fall on their flanks. Following closely behind the infantry, 2 sets of Swedish cavalry were placed on each flank. The Swedish army was so small in comparison to that of the Russians that the French general in command was convinced that this force was only a feint, or the vanguard for a larger attack. Due to this, he neglected to adequately position his troops to brace for the Swedish charge. The entire Russian position was supposedly protected from the center by a huge hill which was topped with artillery and chevaux de frise, or anti-cavalry wooden stakes. This was deemed the most defensible area by the Russians. Therefore, it was selected by Charles as the point on which the infantry assault would be focused. At 2 p.m. on November 17, 1700, the Swedish attack was about to commence when a massive snowstorm arrived. Swedish generals began calling off the attack all across the line, but Charles would hear nothing of it. He explained to his officers that the storm was being whipped up into the faces of the Russians. He ordered his officers to execute the assault as planned. All along the Swedish line, their battle cry, quote, "God med hjälp," unquote, or with God's help, rippled like a wave through the Scandinavians, Balts, Finns, and Germans who composed the Karelians. As the Swedish came into effective combat range, the Russian musketeers were completely blinded with snow. This made their first volley ineffective, as many shots flew over the heads of the Swedes. The first Swedish volley, delivered at point-blank range, devastated the Russians. Robert Massey says this Swedish volley caused the Russians to fall, quote, like grass, unquote. The next Russian volley was more effective and killed many Swedes, but by that point, Swedish swords and pikes were leveled and the men were charging up and over the 9-foot walls and slaughtering Russians in droves. What was a battle was now an absolute massacre of the Russians, who were hemmed in by the fortifications they had built to protect themselves. Swedish cavalry followed close behind. Once they were out in the open, they rampaged through Russian units. Unlike other militaries of the time who charged their horses at a trot, Swedish cavalry charged at full tilt, knee to knee. The Swedes then proceeded to roll up the Russian flank, carrying beleaguered Russians into the teeth of the besieged city. At this point, the Swedish garrison sallied out, throwing their weight behind the assault. The only Russian units which held were the recently commissioned European-style guard units, who formed a square formation and held out atop a hill until the end of the fighting, when they ultimately surrendered. All throughout the fight, Charles was at the front, encouraging his men and suffering alongside them. Besides having his horse shot out from under him, he was struck with a bullet in his chest, though its velocity had tapered off significantly and it fell harmlessly from his cravat after the battle. It would be the first of 5 bullets to strike him. The only escape for the Russians was over a single bridge, which collapsed under the weight of the thousands of panicked conscripts. Thousands drowned in the Narva River. The few who escaped ran a panicked route back to their families. Those Russians who were still fighting were compelled to surrender to King Charles. At the cost of about 1,800 casualties, the Swedish army had killed or drowned 9,000 Russians, forced over 20,000 to surrender, and effectively annihilated the only Russian army between Charles and Moscow. There were so many Russian POWs that Charles was worried these prisoners would be able to launch a successful mutiny. With a single gesture of his hand, all the Russians not of high rank were released unconditionally, while Russian officers remained imprisoned for several years. Besides the losses in men, Russia had lost all its artillery and nearly all of their battle standards. Tsar Peter was forced to melt down church bells to rapidly churn out new pieces of artillery because the Swedish army had so completely decimated the Russian reserves.